Biology, Anthropology, and Women's Studies. And I'd like to welcome you to the second in the lecture series, the Nancy Rowell Jackman Chair Lecture Series. And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce to you Dr. Anne Fausto-Sterling. Dr. Fausto-Sterling is a professor of medical science at Brown University in Rhode Island. In her field of specialization, developmental genetics, Dr. Fausto-Sterling has produced numerous articles on Drosophila, that is, fruit fly development. As a feminist scholar, she has also written extensively and critically in the history and philosophy of science, and in particular on the importance of recognizing the complex relationships among gender, social class, and race, and the development and consequences of scientific work. In her book, Myths of Gender, Biological Theories About Women and Men, Dr. Fausto-Sterling explores, from a feminist and scientific perspective, a variety of biological explanations for female and male behavior. In a rigorous and accessible manner, she challenges the notion of direct biological control over human behavior, arguing instead that in order to fully appreciate the impact of the interplay between biology and environment on human behavior, we must fully recognize the extent to which science and scientists, and I quote, are influenced by the political needs and urgencies of their society, close quote. The national and international recognition her work has received is reflected in the fact that she has held numerous distinguished visiting professorships in the United States and Europe. Dr. Fausto-Sterling's topic this evening is Reclassifying Biology, Race, Gender, and Adam's Task. I understand that this is based on work that she is currently undertaking. So now, without further ado, I'll turn things over to Dr. Fausto-Sterling. Welcome.
It's not only work that I'm currently undertaking, but you all are my first guinea pigs. And so I wanted to try to place what I'm doing a little bit for you before I actually get into the talk. I've just begun work on a new book which is sort of based on a course that I give at Brown called The Biology of Gender. The title of the book is tentatively Human Hermaphrodites and Lesbian Lizards, and then, you know, the inevitable colon, a feminist rewriting of biology. And what I plan to do in the book, which is what I do in the course, is to teach about biology, to write about biology, integrating it into its historical and cultural context, rather than writing about it and teaching about it as if it were a form of knowledge which sort of recently appeared out of nowhere and sort of set itself down as the truth that we read in these huge books. At least the one at, for years, the one at Brown was this big, huge book called Life, and which you had to be very strong and fit to carry around because it was so big, and which is most biology textbooks, most science textbooks are written as if the knowledge in them has come from nowhere. And so what this book is about doing, the book that I'm in the process of working on is about doing, is trying to write about biological knowledge as if it came from somewhere, because indeed it did come from somewhere. Now, more specifically, what I'll talk to you about tonight is the chapter that I'm currently working on biological theories of classification, which is the word classification, taxonomy, systematics. It's an essential component of biology. How do we decide what animals belong in what groups and what plants belong in what groups? The chapter is really it's, from my point of view, completely ambitious, because I am not trained as an historian, and it is a 3-century sweep. And what I would really like from those of you in the audience who know more history than I do tonight is to tell me at the end of the talk where I've got it wrong, because I'm sure that there are places where I don't have it quite right yet. You should see what my study looks like at the moment, and it's just littered with books and Xeroxes and things. But I begin, as I'll explain why in a minute, in the 18th century, and sort of have divided up, periodized the work so that we look at theories of classification in the 18th century, which is when Linnaeus began supposedly the modern era of biological classification. And then look at the period from 1800 until the publication of Origin of the Species in the 1850s. Then from the period from the Origin of the Species to the 1950s, a sort of 100 years of Darwin. And then finally, I plan to look at the more contemporary, the current views of biological classification and how they work, and how they are an evidence of particular ways of thinking and particular kinds of knowledge construction that reflect our social needs and views. Luckily for you, I haven't gotten past Darwin. So, so you're only hearing the first part of this chapter tonight, and as I said, it's very new. I mean, I really finished writing as far as I've gotten on Friday, last Friday, and I would very much be interested in your feedback as we go along. So with that as a sort of background for what I'm doing and where I'm coming from, let me tell you what I've come up with so far. God worried that Adam would be lonely in the Garden of Eden. And out of the ground, this is a quote from Genesis, out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast in the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helpmeet for him. And so, as you know, God took one of Adam's ribs, made a woman, and brought her to him. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." No less than God, it seems, gave Adam the right to label beings that walk the earth, a right so powerful that he could use it to name and define women along with all the other animals. The power to name is the power to define. Tonight, I will discuss some of the systems biologists have used and currently use to name and categorize living things. I do not, as historian and evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr has written, believe in some unqualified way that, quote, diversity has occupied man's mind ever since there has been man, end quote. Rather, I will ask why biologists chose particular systems of naming and inquire as to what and whom they gained power over by defining in particular ways. Customarily, one begins a discussion of modern systematics with Linnaeus, although he in fact had a history which preceded him. And in terms of the transformation of the study of natural history into the science of biology, the 18th century, which is when Linnaeus lived, seems a good starting place. Why did a comprehensive and functional system of classification become necessary in that time period, and what made it possible? Mayr argues that it was not until the 18th century, quote, the beginning of the great era of voyages, that the need for a fully comprehensive taxonomy emerged. European travelers scoured the world, returning home with samples of exotic plants and animals. These they arranged in herbariums and museums, putting things side by side that had hitherto been found in distant corners of the earth. They enabled local study, that is, that of the European in Europe, to become a study of the universal. Linnaeus, for example, put together his Systema Naturae after studying at gardens and herbariums in Holland. He didn't need to see nature in situ, but only to travel locally to a place where it had been collected for him. The invention of the microscope opened yet another frontier. Here again, it was the Dutch in the 16th century who developed the technology, enabling naturalists of the future to extend their realm of vision to the hitherto invisible. Finally, woodcut making provided the technology to communicate findings in a more permanent fashion. At the same time, it permitted the author or artist to extract essential detail from the plant or animal to be named, opening up a new era of sight and partial vision. Historians sometimes present the 18th century natural history explorers as heroes who lost their lives in the pursuit of science. Again, quoting from Ernst Mayr. Linnaeus sent his best students to bring back exotic plants, but some of the best succumbed to tropical diseases. The tragedy was even greater in the East Indies, where the flower of European zoology succumbed to tropical diseases or murder during a 30-year period. This included the most enthusiastic and gifted naturalists of the period, their dream being to contribute to the knowledge of animal life in the tropics. The expeditions to foreign lands, the maintenance of museums and herbariums at home, and the new technological developments cost money. Royalty and wealthy businessmen paid fabulous sums to build collections of exotica. For example, in 1754, at Linnaeus's request, Queen Louisa Ulrica paid 14,000 copper thalers to recover collections left in the Middle East by Linnaeus's student Hasselquist, who had died during his voyage. Linnaeus himself had a Chinese tea service decorated with Linnea motifs. The East India Company footed the bill. Linnaeus lost 4 students sent out to the Far East on explorations. All went aboard Swedish and Danish East India Trading Company vessels. It seems that they were not merely heroic explorers, but participants in European colonization of the East. Excuse me. From where, then, did the money come to develop the resources which enabled the growth of modern systematics? Let me sketch out a general answer here with the certainty that the details of any specific fortune could be pinned down in an analogous fashion. First example, in the 1560s, John Hawkins made several trips to West Africa, stole slaves, and sold them to the Spanish in America. His profits were so great that Queen Elizabeth I invested in his next trip by providing him with a ship named Jesus. Second example, Africans mined Central and South American gold and silver, providing money to finance further world voyages. A third example, in the 17th century, the Dutch used African gold to mint the gold coin, which helped Amsterdam to become the financial capital of Europe. Well, the new gold coin struck in 1663 by the English was called the guinea because it first contained gold imported from the Guinea coast of West Africa. It is no accident that the gardens and herbariums Linnaeus used to increase his knowledge of plant life from around the world resided in Holland, which had accumulated huge wealth from its world trade system. The extent of the changes wrought by obtaining wealth from Africa, the Americas, and the Far East is often obfuscated in histories about European development. The following, however, suggests what some of the networks felt like. Throughout the 17th and 18th century, and for most of the 19th century, the exploitation of Africa and African labor continued to be the source of the accumulation of capital to be reinvested in Western Europe. The effects were so wide-ranging that many are seldom brought to the notice of the reading public. The French Saint-Malo fishing industry was revived by the opening of markets in the French slave plantations, while the Portuguese in Europe depended heavily on dyes like indigo, camwood, Brazil wood, and cochineal brought from Africa and the Americas. Gum from Africa also played a part in the textile industry. Then there was the export of ivory from Africa, producing items ranging from knife handles to piano keys. The story of modern systematics connects profoundly to the development of European capitalism. The exploration and trading ships brought scientists to distant lands. The wealth of these lands, including the human capital of the slave system, provided the money needed to maintain the museums and collections, both public and private, of Western Europe, to pay the salaries of investigators such as Linnaeus, who had no personal wealth with which to begin his career, although he rather consciously married a woman whose father had wealth in order to get himself to Holland in the first place. Just a little interesting sidelight. And the capital financed the sorts of technological developments represented by the microscope, printing, and woodcutting, which furthered the development of Euro-American biology. The project of systematizing the living beings of the world as enormous an undertaking as it seemed in and of itself, was part of a larger project of world domination by the European and, in the 19th and 20th centuries, U.S. capital. It should not surprise us, then, that the application of systematics to human populations served a clear purpose: to differentiate white Westerners from other peoples of the world. As Winthrop Jordan puts it, quote, "Slavery was typically a Negro-white relationship. This meant that the Negro would not be accorded a high place when Europeans set about arranging the varieties of men on a grand scale," end quote. I'll return to this point later. What did the 18th century classifiers do with this new wealth of information about biological diversity? Before the 18th century, herbalists, for example, classified plants based on their practical uses. Writers grouped animals on the basis of similarities. A history of the birds, for example, grouped ones which hunted at night, ones which lived on water, and ones which fed on living flesh. In this period, people wrote histories, not natural histories, of animals and plants, and these histories provided a unitary fabric of all that was visible of things and of the signs that had been discovered or lodged within them. This entailed not only a description of their body parts and functions, but also of the resemblances to be found within them. Hence, a liverwort had liver-shaped leaves. The powers thought to lie within these resemblances, hence a possible medicinal use for liver ailments. And the legends and stories in which the organism held some place, the place of the animal or plant in heraldry, the foods it provided, and what travelers and ancient thinkers might have said of it. In writing what came to be called natural histories, Linnaeus popularized a rather different mode of description. Every chapter dealing with a given animal, he felt, should follow the following plan: name, theory, kind, species, attributes, use, and to conclude, literaria. All language deposited by time is pushed back into the very last category, like a supplement in which discourse is allowed to recount itself and record discoveries, traditions, beliefs, and poetical figures. That was a quote from Michel Foucault, who's written extensively about this. Foucault argues that the classical age, which he says ran from the Renaissance until the start of the 19th century, gave to history the task of careful examination of things themselves, devoid of their prior meanings and commitments, and hence we can see the ultimate carrying out of that by the publication of science textbooks in which they are written as if there were no prior meanings or commitments. What became foremost was the definition and readings of characters, visible traits which could be used to differentiate one organism from another. The focus on sight excluded not only hearsay, but also all the other senses: touch, smell, and taste. Scientists could reduce organisms to sets of words and printable images. The choice of characters then became the focus of a great deal of debate. Which ones best enabled the separation of one set of organisms from another? Which ones made classification and identification easy to do? For Linnaeus, the reproductive organs loomed large. If we observe God's works, he wrote, it becomes more than sufficiently evident to everybody that each living being is propagated from an egg. To illustrate the generation of plants, we must take our first lights from the animal kingdom and pursue the chain of nature until it leads us to the vegetables. It is thus reasonable to ask how the Linnaean sexual system fits into a history of sexuality in the 18th century Europe. The meanings of gender and the accounts of sex which these visions produced changed profoundly during the 18th century. During the Renaissance, people conceptualized gender according to what Thomas Laqueur has called a one-sex model. Human sexuality lay on a continuum of heat and cold. Hotter representing masculinity, cold greater femininity. Many kinds of males and females existed along a continuum of hot to cold. And it's important that there was a continuum of different kinds of males and females. This is very different than our current conception of what sex and gender is about. The vagina as a named entity did not exist before the 18th century, and the ovaries were often labeled as testes in anatomical diagrams. The role of a female could have testes, only hers had less heat than a man's. The roles of the sexes, that is, their gender, were ordained by the gods or the cosmos. The body simply reflected that ordination. Then, according to Thomas Laqueur, sometime in the 18th century, sex as we know it was invented, end quote. A two-sex model in which male and female represented separate beings appeared. Scientists started to use separate names for male and female sex organs, and the body became the place to locate gender differences. The move to a bodily accounting of sexual difference did not result from new scientific discoveries, although scientists have continued to uncover new details about sexual reproduction. Instead, this move to locate sexual difference on what Laqueur calls the flat, horizontal, immovable foundation of physical fact grew out of the political struggles of the Age of Enlightenment. The same capitalist growth which brought the world's organisms to Europe for classification also signaled the end of European feudalism and the development of new political systems. Proponents of the rights of man, challenged the divine rights of feudal rulers. Endless political struggles, to say nothing of the French and American revolutions, reorganized the Euro-American worldview. Feminists argued that the rights of man ought to extend to women. And if all men were created equal, then how could one justify slavery? The body itself became the last refuge of scoundrels. Women's bodies became different from men's, blacks different from whites. It is within this context that Linnaeus started with the animal kingdom and read downward to the plants. All plants, he argued, reproduce sexually, and thus the best way to divide the plants was by examining the structure of their flowers, which he described in the following way. I'm going to read you the description, and then I'm going to show you a drawing from a contemporary textbook of a flower. This is what Linnaeus wrote about the flower. The calyx is the bedchamber, the corolla the curtains, the filaments the spermatic vessels, the anthers the testes, the pollen the sperm, the stigma the vulva, the style the vagina, the germen the ovary, the pericarp the fecundating ovary, and the seed the ovum. Now think about that description and try and correlate it with the first slide. Which is a drawing from a modern biology textbook of a flower, showing you, using somewhat different words, the petals of the flower, the stigma, the filament, the pericarp, the ovary, and the ovules. And notice that some of these words, which are words that come from human anatomy, are the words that are still used to label the flower. The main thing I want you to do is to juxtapose in your mind what you're looking at here and this description of Linnaeus of what the flower is, and just to keep that in mind as we go on. Linnaeus defined 24 classes of plants based on the number of pistils and stamens which he found in the flower. A flower with 3 stamens and 1 pistil he described as 3 husbands in the same marriage. Those with many pistils he described as polygamies. Husbands live with wives and concubines. And those for which he could find no sexual parts, for example, mosses and ferns, he designated as cryptogams, that is, clandestine marriages in which the nuptials were celebrated privately. Let's hit the next slide, or I guess I can do that, can I? Yeah. This shows you his system as it was translated into this is Erasmus Darwin's translation. And Darwin translated Linnaeus' work in a long poem called The Loves of Plants. And what you can see is his recounting, which is actually a fairly accurate translation from the Latin. If you've looked at the Latin, it's not too off key. And it's a key to the plant sexual system, and as you can see, it's the marriage of plants, and it goes through, this is a summary, public marriages and flowers visible to everyone and one bed, husbands and wife have the same bed. It all depends on how the pistils and stamens and anthers and all those guys are hooked up to one another. And it goes all the way down through the number of different males that you can have with one female, and then whether or not they're subordinated to one another, and then two beds. These are plants that have separate flowers, male flowers and female flowers, which many of you know about. He describes as having husband and wife have separate beds, and then they could be in the same flower or in different flowers. And then there's the clandestine marriages down at the very bottom. So clearly, the Linnaean system, which is the one we all learn in our textbooks, there's usually a one-paragraph wave at history in our textbooks in which it says that Linnaeus developed the first modern system of classification. No one talks about the way in which it grew out of the sexual politics of the period in which he was writing, but I think this makes it more than self-evident. Linnaeus provided a practical method of sorting out the plants. Horticulturists, as well as other scientists, applauded him, and his vision of plant classification became widely used throughout Western Europe. But he was not without his critics. Some found his work obscene. Charles Alston, an Englishman, wrote, quote, "No imagined analogy between plants and animals can warrant or excuse the fulsome and obscene names imposed by sexualists on the different parts of the fructification of vegetables," end quote. Others rejected the use of single characters. That is, they rejected the idea that plants were, that sexual parts alone were sufficient to give you a good classification, arguing instead that many features of the plant ought to be used in addition to attention to the sexual parts. Michael Adamson, for example, whose dates are 1727 to 1806, urged classifiers to consider the root, stem, leaves, flowers, fruit, and other qualities in order to arrive at what he, at quote, a natural and invariable families, end quote. And he also believed that some plants were completely asexual. According to Meyer, quote, "Every principle promoted by Adamson has now become part of the taxonomic methodology," end quote. Yet his work gained little popularity in his own time, a fact which Meyer attributes to, quote, "a virtually dictatorial Linnaean authority," end quote, but which I suggest may also be attributable to the force of the sexual analogy in an age where the establishment of the naturalness of sexual difference remained a political imperative. 18th century approaches to animal classification were of less practical use than those for systematizing plants. That is, they weren't as successful out in the field. In the 16th and 17th century, scholars divided animals according to what we would now, using the criteria of what we would now call ecology and behavior. According to Meyer, progress was not made until function and habitat as classifying criteria were replaced by structure. Foucault found the earlier classifications to be based on the extent to which animals shared common features. He argues that in the 18th century, the focus, that in the 18th century, the focus shifted away from an emphasis on signs or marks which united groups of animals. For example, grouping birds as ones which hunted food at night, or ones which fed on living flesh. In the 18th century, such groupings became unsatisfactory because they overlapped. That is, some birds which hunt at night also feed on living flesh. And thus they could not be used to organize the birds into different groupings. Both the method of identifying organisms and the systems of classifying them shifted to ones in which scientists laid out identities on a general grid of differences. The very process of classification involved the differentiation of one trait from the next, a process which remains with us in identification manuals. And you can see this on the next slide. This is a key to the genera of North American triclads. Triclads are planaria, and I happen to be working on them right now, which is why I happen to have this. But what you see is a process here, represented a process here by which you sequentially differentiate by finding differences. So under 1 up here it says you look for the shape of the internal muscle zone of the pharynx, and if it's laid out one way, you move from 1 to 2. If it's laid out the other way, you move from 1 to 9. And so you start out and you say, all right, it's got internal muscle zone consisting of one layer intermingled with circular longitudinal fibers, and then so that means you're in the family Dendrocelidae, and then you move to 9, and then you have two choices. You can have the you can have the anterior end with deeply invaginated adhesive organ, and that will be one of the genuses. But if it's not that, then if the anterior end has an adhesive disc, then you'd move to point 10 here, and then again you have two choices. And if there's a penis with a bulb and a papilla, you move on to 11, and then you have those two choices. So it's a sequential thing where each time you look for a difference, and you weed out, and you move on to the next step. And that kind of method is the sort of method that Linnaeus used successfully for plants, and that people began to develop for animals. So built into this method is a preference for emphasizing difference, or as late 20th century writers might put it, for creating the other. Starting still from a human pinnacle, Linnaeus was quick to recognize the limited nature of zoological knowledge. Zoology, he wrote, the noblest part of natural history, is much less worked up than the other two parts. By the way, the Systema Naturae, still in that period, there was not a separation of living from non-living, and so he wrote about classification of minerals, classifications of plants, and classifications of animals, all in this single text. If, however, we take into account either the movement or the mechanism of the external and internal senses, or lastly, the shape of the animals, which surpasses all the others, it will be clear as the sun to everyone that animals are the highest and most perfect works of the Creator, end quote. Linnaeus divided animals into 6 groups: the quadrupeds, birds, amphibia, fishes, insects, and worms. These he separated from one another using a variety of criteria, including modes of parity, that is, whether they were viviparous or oviparous, etc., types of body coverings, that is, whether they had hair, scale, feathers, etc. The worms remained a catch-all category for any invertebrate too difficult to otherwise categorize. The quadrupeds, or as they were translated into English, the mammalia, he separated further into 7 groups based primarily on types of teeth and the presence or absence of legs. Whales received their own grouping because they lacked legs. And this is the general, oh, not quite yet. Well, we leave that up. Actually, let me not leave it up, because it'll distract us. Linnaeus clearly and forthrightly counted the genus Homo, which he defined as walking erect, body naked, except in a few places. Well, that's accurate, right? He defined this genus among 4 groups of primates. Many agree with him that this was many agree that this was a genuine first, a recognition by a scientist with great authority that humans were a sort of animal. He further divided Homo into 2 groups, one he called sapiens, which he said were diurnal and varying by education and situation, and the other he called monstrous, which he said were varying by by climate or art. And actually, I will throw this up because this is his classification of Homo, and you can look at it as I'm reading. In turn, he divided Homo sapiens into wild men, whom he described as 4-footed, mute, and hairy, American, who he described as copper-colored, choleric, erect, and regulated by customs, Europeans, whom he described as fair, sanguine, brawny, and governed by laws, Asiatics, whom he described as sooty, melancholy, rigid, and governed by opinions, and Africans, whom he described as black, phlegmatic, relaxed, and governed by caprice. Translators treat Linnaeus's monstrous category with minor differences. For example, Winthrop Jordan includes the category rush-like girls with narrowed stomach from Europe, who might have been anorexics, in fact, or some along with the categories of mountaineer, Patagonian, Hottentot, beardless, who were Americans, head conic, or Chinese, who were Chinese, and head flattened, who were Canadian. Besides the divisions, despite these divisions, Linnaeus believed that all humans belong to the same species descended from a single original stock. Their variation, he believed, depended upon climate and lifestyle. Quote, "Thus the heat of the sun blackens the Moor and turns his hair into a curled wool. So likewise the cold of the northern zone affects the white color and small stature of its inhabitants. All these differences run so much into one another that there is properly no distinct limits between them." Linnaeus then reported on human difference, but seemed not to judge it. His categories, as Winthrop Jordan wrote, were not hierarchical, they were merely confusing. But they were designed when one of the major intellectual challenges was to justify European superiority over the rest of the world. To this end, Enlightenment thinkers devised 4 major theories to explain the origins of human difference. The Linnaean theory of environmental and educational difference vied with the idea that whiteness represented the natural condition and non-whiteness a state of degeneracy caused by the environment. These, in turn, contended with the concept of the great chain of being. According to this viewpoint, all living things represented part of a great chain linking the most primitive to the most advanced, Homo sapiens providing the link between the creatures of God and God himself. Non-whites belonged to the group Homo, but represented lesser species, lower links on the primate chain. And finally, there was the theory of separate creations, the contention that non-whites remained on the earth as remnants of a pre-Adamic but only partially successful attempts at human creation. Only whites, descended from Adam, contained the stuff of genuine men. Another historian, Popkin, argues that 18th century thinkers continuously transformed explanations of human diversity from neutral to normative ones. He attributes this phenomenon to 3 factors. First, the waning of the conviction that all peoples, regardless of looks, represented images of God. Second, the growth of naturalistic explanations which permitted normative judgments. While finally, and most important, there was an economic need to justify African slavery and the rape of America. More recently, historian Harriet Ritvo argues that 18th century animal systematics represented less of an intellectual jump than conventional historians maintain. Instead, she suggests that the trappings of classification could legitimize any mode of discrimination and arrangement. 18th century zoological systematists, she suggests, used the metaphor of scientific classification, but achieved far less than met the eye. The roles of gender and race differ in Linnaean classification. The universality of gender became the method and the system imposed upon the entire plant world. Although Linnaeus reduced both race and gender to visible structure, he did not similarly impose race on the animal kingdom. Rather, he used it only to categorize varieties of humans. For animals, sexual systems appeared as at least one among several useful in categorizing zoological variety. In the late 18th century, some characteristics took on a dual life as differentiators of both the human sexes and the races. One such example is hair. Recall that Linnaeus used hairlessness to distinguish Homo from other primates. But hairiness distinguished both men from women and Europeans from people of color. Linnaeus lectured that, quote, "God gave men beards for ornaments and to distinguish them from women," end quote. Immanuel Kant used beardlessness as one of his lines of attack against scientifically learned women. While the apparent absence of facial hair in Native American males became the subject of serious scientific debate. Some scientists argued that Native Americans had no facial hair, while others suggested that Indians pluck their beard out whenever it appears. Even sparse pubic hair, a fact recorded in many 19th century postmortems done on women of color, denoted a primitive state, although the justifications became convoluted. Among European men, a heavy beard represented virility and sexual prowess. Yet non-Europeans of both sexes, usually portrayed as overly sexed and wanton, also distinguish themselves by their lack of facial and their limited pubic hair. If we move along to look at pre-Darwinian classifications in the 19th century, we see a period of transition. Sex, gender, and race preoccupied Euro-American intellectuals of the 19th century. Middle-class culture put into operation an entire machinery for producing true discourses about sex and race. The emergence under Queen Victoria of a new British Empire, the continued use of slaves and the attendant battles about slavery, combined with the emergence of a new era in biology, gave both urgency and possibility to the scientific arguments. Feminists challenged conventional views in the fields of education, the law, and politics. And quoting now from another historian, scientists responded with a detailed and sustained examination of differences between women and men, which justified their differing social roles. Anatomy and physiology, evolutionary biology, physical anthropology, psychology, and sociology evolved comprehensive theories of sexual difference. Such intense, authoritative, and voluminous discussion about race and gender must certainly have affected the ideas of 19th century biologists interested in classification, even of classification of animals that seem to have nothing to do with humans. In neither the 18th nor the 19th century did scientists understand the role of the male in fertilization. The function, if any, of the sperm was the object of heated debate, but in both centuries, most people believed the sperm to have only some stimulatory effect on the egg, if it had any at all. The fact of nuclear fusion and its genetic significance was not understood until the end of the 19th century. Until then, reproduction was interpreted to be uniquely female. Despite the similarity of viewpoints in both centuries, however, biologists in the 19th century interpreted sexual reproduction very differently. 18th century biologists based their system on the idea that sex was universal, but by the middle of the 19th century, asexual reproduction has risen in status. Sex lost status as a classificatory mechanism for plants, while discoveries of extensive asexuality among both plants and animals reverberated within the scientific communities. Among the discoveries of 19th century biologists were the realization that all plants, including the cryptogams, reproduce both sexually and asexually. The mosses and ferns, for example, have free-living generations which are asexual in nature, and I'll show you this in a sec. They arise from the germination of a spore. This asexually reproduced generation, in modern terms we'd call it the diploid stage, however, produces gametes which fuse, and that's the sexual reproductive stage, to form the sexually produced or diploid generation. And I'll put on the next slide here. Shows you, this is an example of the fern life cycle, and what it shows, modern biologists call these the gametophyte and the sporophyte generations. And what you have is in the gametophyte generation, you have a spore landing and producing a gametophyte, which is called, in ferns, it's called the prothallus, and it's a form of the plant that you mostly have probably never noticed. It's a little tiny part, multicellular stage, that you may, if you're really into it, you may have noticed one, but otherwise you haven't. But it starts from an asexual seed, but it produces sex cells, and those sex cells then fuse and germinate, take root to form the spore-producing plant, which is what you know of as the fern. And that spore-producing plant, the fern, produces the spores, which are themselves asexual, and they reproduce the cycle. So it turns out that plants have this cycle is called this. It's called this alternation of sexual and asexual generations is now called the alternation of generations. Throughout the 19th century, botanists argued heatedly about the alternation of generations, its meaning, and its applicability to plant classification. Some semblance of unanimity arrived only in the early 20th century. after the confluence of chromosome and genetic studies made possible a uniform theory. Although I'll return to this later in the essay, here I need only point out that one of the startling results would be that Linnaeus's precious flower, about which he wrote, "The petal of the flower in itself contributes nothing to generation, but only serves as the bridal bed, and garnished with such bed curtains, and perfumed with so many delicate scents, in order that the bridegroom with his bride may therein celebrate their nuptials with so much greater solemnity. When the bed has been so prepared, it is the time for the bridegroom to embrace his darling bride and loose himself in her." Now, this is his description of the flower, which in the 19th century people suddenly discover is the asexual part. So that flower turns out to be asexual after all. German botanists, foremost among them Matthias Schleiden and Wilhelm Hofmeister, began the complex task of understanding the cryptogams and offering more detail about the reproductive process in groups such as the conifers. Their work demonstrated that most, if not all, plants had two, often morphologically different aspects to their life cycle. One of these resulted from the asexual germination of a spore and led to the growth of a plant which could in turn produce gametes. The gametes then united to produce the alternative plant type, which in turn produced spores once more, as we've seen up here. In extending his work to conifers, Hofmeister arrived at the startling conclusion that the majestic trees which dot our northern forests represented the asexual stage, while the reproductive form had been reduced to microscopic events. 19th century plant taxonomists then shifted from the mere inspection of external sexual features to a consideration of the intangible life cycle, and this in turn they found to contain significant evidence of asexuality. The discoveries of asexuality in animals paralleled those in plants. Many invertebrates turned out to have both asexual and sexual generations, which, as with the mosses and ferns, often had very different morphologies. Beyond that, it turned out that many organisms with egg-producing females could produce live offspring without the presence of a male. Aphids are a good example of that. In fact, these discoveries became the locus of anxieties about the role of the male on the one hand, and provided support for the increasingly popular stereotype of the passionless female on the other. Sex, as a universal aspect of both plant and animal reproduction, lost status in the 19th century. It is difficult to determine to what extent biological theories of sexual reproduction and the plant classification systems they produced were determined by social attitudes about sex, and to what extent vice versa. Nevertheless, the changes seem to parallel one another. The great debates about sexual difference engendered by the political conflicts of the period produced an official and very much middle-class-based version of females as lacking in passion. Remember that this is class-based, that the working classes were felt to be sexually out of control, and that middle-class men felt working-class women to be fair sexual game. To say nothing of women of color in situations where people of color and Caucasians live together, for example, on slave plantations. Phrenologists, for example, found that women had smaller cerebellums, that region of the brain held to control the response to sexual pleasure. Marriage manuals exhorted women to fake orgasms if they weren't having a good time, and urged men to be sensitive to their wives' lesser desires. The lowered status of sex in 19th century biology also reflected a change in the social standing of the scientists themselves. While wealthy aristocrats dominated 18th century biology, 19th century biologists were more and more members of the sexually more prudent middle classes. The biological theories to which they subscribed, an almost sexless egg-laying female and a reproductively insignificant, energizing male, were as much a reflection of middle-class values as they were the result of the biologist's scientific discoveries. 19th century zoologists used two developments to improve upon the far from satisfactory taxonomic systems of the 18th century. The first, alluded to above, was the focus on life cycles rather than external structure. The second was to recognize the diversity of the animal interior. Internal organ systems became the focus of a generation of comparative anatomists and supplied new information on which to base systems of animal classification. The internal laws of the organism were to replace differential characters as the object of the natural sciences. Key in both these developments, as well as their application to human racial classifications, was Georges Cuvier, a Swiss scientist whose dates are 1769 to 1832. Cuvier believed that certain physiological systems controlled others, more subordinate parts of the organism. This relationship resulted in a correlation of parts. An anatomist given only a small part, for example, a tooth, he felt, could make a variety of statements about the entire organism. Cuvier divided animals into 4 branches: the vertebrates, the mollusks, the articulates, and the radiates. One of the vertebrate classes, the mammals, he further subdivided into bimana, the 2 hands, and quadrumana, 4-footed, and 7 additional classes. In general, his systems more closely resemble 20th century understandings of animal relationships than did those of Linnaeus. And so he's considered to have advanced the process of zoological classification significantly. Before 1805, Cuvier used the organs of nutrition and circulation as his major diagnostic characters. But by 1807, he replaced these with the nervous system. Here again, we can see the markings of a human-centered system. As did Linnaeus, Cuvier classified from the top down, from the more complex to the simpler. Thus, he started with the vertebrate nervous system, so exquisitely represented by the human brain and spinal cord, and derived from it the organizing principle for all of animal biology. I should say it's an organizing principle that is pretty much intact today, with lots of changes, but at least in some circles it's intact today. Cuvier brought to his studies detailed accounts of animal dissections, as well as an understanding that fossils represented living forms which had become extinct. Nevertheless, he resisted belief in the great chain of being in its most dogmatic form, believing instead that its branches were unlinked, representing only an order established by God at the moment of creation. But the idea of gradation crept into his work and was essential to the field of comparative anatomy he did so much to establish. The structure of the nervous system became the taxonomic organizer for all animal life. Cuvier further believed that the system's structure determined its function. He believed that the graded increases in nervous system complexity represented by his classification system explained the gradual increase in intellectual faculties found as one progressed from the radiates and articulates to the vertebrates, and within the vertebrates from fishes to mammals. Cuvier, it seems, wanted nothing less than to provide an organizational rationale for a scale of intelligence. He developed a science of external signs representing deeper meanings. When Linnaeus used external features such as skin color and hair conformation to classify humans, he gave them no deeper or symbolic meaning. In contrast, Cuvier and many others offered the idea that the relationship between the area of the mid-cranial part of the head and face provided a measure of mental faculties. Animals with larger faces were more governed by sensation, while those with larger mid-cranial areas remained relatively independent of external stimuli. Peter Camper's facial angle could be read in the same fashion. A long snout and lowered forehead denoted low intelligence and high animality, while a high facial angle indicated the highest intelligence. Cuvier could then move full circle. Starting from humans, he organized a system of classification based on the complexity and types of organization of the nervous system, and postulated a functional relationship between the nervous system and degree of intelligence. From this, it seemed only natural to assess nervous system structure within groups and to look particularly at the differentiation among humans. Thus, Cuvier talked of a scale of human races that passed from an index of intelligence of 30% for apes, 30 degrees. This has to do with this. Oops, it's conifers. Forget them. Has to do with with this kind of drawing, which is a 19th saying, is that scientific work reflects the ideas and belief systems of its time, and then the history of our ideas and belief systems, because we don't make up new, we build on old histories. And that because of that, the way we choose to organize knowledge about the natural world always seems right or natural to us in the moment. The knowledge that we have built and the knowledge which we have built and transformed and which we teach to our students bears the social markings of both the past and the present. And we at best mislead them and at worst lie to them about the nature of reality if we fail to help them understand this. Thank you, and I'd be happy to have questions or comments. I want corrections, remember. Did any of this surprise any of you?
I don't know if this is a fair question, but I wonder if you'd leap ahead a bit. Are you intending to develop a new classification system based on a feminist?
No.
Okay.
No.
Oh, gee, I was hoping you were. Then in what sense do you think we can move to a more corrective? I mean, you talked about the normative part of the classification system that we currently have. Would there be any way that you could move to in some direction where you have a more egalitarian normative viewpoint in your observations and your classification system?
First of all, if you move to modern classification systems, they're based on rather different systems of our notion of the way in which they've really changed is that we've changed our notion of what the organism is. We no longer conceptualize the organism as a set of physiologies where we give priority, as Cuvier did, to the nervous system or something. Modern classification systems conceptualize the organism as a set of information. And this is a very post-World War II, post-cybernetic, comes out of the military development of information processing. I mean, that's the sort of direction I'll take this in, is showing where our current knowledge, how our current knowledge system works. They, as a system of organizing animals and plants, none of them are perfect and they work well enough. I mean, they work for some purposes and not for others. So it's not, I don't necessarily think we have to go and I don't think there's some true way to classify animals and plants. In terms of their use with regard to race and gender, I think that there has been a very profound rejection after World War II by biologists, and it's one that hasn't gotten out into the rest of the world very much, of the notion of race as a fixed something that one can apply to individuals. Biologists now conceptualize race in terms of populations of genes. They don't conceptualize it in terms of any external characteristics that you can see at all. And furthermore, biologists argue that the differences that the genetic differences between the socially constructed races, that is, the groups that we as social beings recognize as racial, are very small, and that they don't actually, so that the notion of race as a biological notion is meaningless. And biologists have essentially thrown the notion of race back into the realm of the social, which is where it always was and where, in my opinion, it fully belongs. It's a social and political issue. Now, the same thing has not happened for conceptualizations of gender in the body. Here we're still very much in a 19th century paradigm where the locus of difference is thrown onto the body. We've found new, and it's very much a Cuvier paradigm. It's thrown onto the brain and the nervous system, and the things that it produces, like pituitary hormones, which is really part of the nervous system. So here we're still struggling. I mean, this is one of the interesting things is that you have different time periods sort of existing side by side in our accounts of the body. And you have the sort of post-cybernetic accounts among molecular biologists sitting side by side with very Victorian and 19th century accounts. And the only way to combat that is not to come up with some true system. There is no true account of the body. Our accounts of the body are always socially constructed. Yeah. The only way to counter that is to teach that, to teach the ways in which we socially construct our knowledge about difference and our knowledge about biology. And what I'm doing here is to show that it works fundamentally back into areas where we wouldn't necessarily expect race or gender to be applicable, like the loves of the plants, where it turns out that our systems are very fundamentally built based from our social systems and not vice versa. Yes, sir. Excuse me?
I was just wondering if you had, in your book that you're writing, if you've dealt with the use of sociobiology and the whole controversy around, because for every time you can come up with a character, you can invent a gene in sociobiology to deal with the issues that are being used to try and justify these socially constructed differences between the genders.
I deal with sociobiology in Myths of Gender. There's a chapter on it as it's been applied to sex differences. I don't know to what extent I'll deal with it again in this book, probably in one chapter. But I really am going to focus, as I did in this talk, much more on systems of biology. I expect this book will teach enough biology that it can be used as a companion text in an introductory biology course. It's not going to be focused primarily. And if you figure, if I did everything on paper that I did today, by the time one was finished reading this chapter, you'd have learned a lot about plant and animal classification and life cycles and things like that. Probably in one chapter, I currently conceptualize a chapter that focuses on bees and the uses of bees to tell stories about social reality through the centuries. And bees, of course, is where the social insects is where contemporary sociobiology lodged itself. I mean, the whole notion of kin selection came out of there. And so I'll probably have something in there about how that came out and then how it was applied to it. I don't know if there was something more specific you wanted me to respond to right now, but.
It just seems there's a lot of new stuff coming out of the literature of late, dealing with evolution of the human nervous system and a lot of clinical psychologists are basically using socially defined behavior characteristics as a way of confirming the existence of genetic.
It's the same circle that Cuvier was locked into, and that circle is still with us today. That circle of reasoning, where you take a human vision, you use it to describe animals, and then you look at the animals and say, this must be natural. That's why humans are like this. I mean, it's the same. I mean, that's just what Cuvier did. That's just what sociobiologists do today.
The current wave of publications are studies on humans. So basically, what seems to be happening is typical sort of, they do surveys and they ask people how they respond to certain things, and of course you get socially structured responses, and then they use that response as saying, oh yeah, well that proves that in fact this
Right.
is genetically
Right.
based.
Other comments? Aren't there any historians in here who want to argue with me about whether I've got the Enlightenment down right or not? I'm very nervous about this. I'd like to be argued with or corrected if I've got it wrong.
If you were conversing with, say, students of biology, say, from the master's level up,
Mm-hmm.
a large number of them, how many of them sort of point blank would acknowledge that classification in their understanding of biology is socially constructed?
Virtually none of them.
None.
Virtually none of them, at least at Brown. Seriously, I don't know. I mean, I think that maybe in other countries science may be taught. I mean, I think there's more receptivity to this notion of social construction of knowledge on the European continent, for example. And so I think the ideas aren't received as hostily as they are in the States.
It's interesting. My line of work is in a different field from biology. It's in the area of family therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And the notion of socially constructed reality has been afoot in that field for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered myself Reality is socially constructed. And at a recent conference that I attended, was a workshop, I did a little survey among 35 of them.
And?
32 out of 35 see reality as socially constructed and work from that basis.
I know. There is such a profound division about what knowledge is and how it comes from between the social sciences and biology and the so-called hard sciences that I travel, since I sort of straddle this fence between both worlds. When I give this kind of talk to a group of people in humanities and social sciences, they sort of say, oh, so what? When, if I give it, well, if I give it to, well, there's two answers to that. One is that no one's ever written about the biology in this way. It's a fairly radical account of biology. The other answer, though, is all you need to do is pick up an introductory level textbook in biology and turn to the chapter on classification, and you will see nothing of this, and there's nothing, zero. It's not present. And when I will give this talk to my department, I'll encounter skepticism, some interest in the historical facts, but mostly a profound inability to get what I'm saying about social construction, because the notion among scientists is that scientific knowledge is something real, physically real, and that it has no social component to it. In fact, that's why a lot of people become scientists, is because they don't want to deal with social components in their lives. No, seriously, it's true. I mean, I'm not saying that nastily. I think you could talk to a lot of scientists and find that that's true, and that it's not a realm that they feel comfortable in, nor that they want to exist in particularly. So.
I'm kind of surprised because I don't study the science, the so-called hard sciences, but I thought that physicists had moved us beyond.
Go sit in a freshman physics classroom for a semester, and you'll see what you think. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to turn this thing all around now.
Great.
First of all, introduce myself and say I'm a biologist, but I feel isolated within my field because I share many of these views.
Mm-hmm.
However, I also want to raise the point. I was reading a book the other day called Refusing to be a Man by John Stoltenberg, and I was really excited about this book because these are big issues, and I'm a feminist, and I do believe that gender is socially constructed. However, I think it gets into the nature-nurture argument again, and the fact that genes do certain things, and there is such a thing as male and female, and yes, there have been hermaphrodite humans before.
1 in 100, by the way.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's not even before. It's a not that uncommon variation among humans.
On hermaphrodite fish and sex-changing fish, and so I'm just saying I'm open to all of this. On the other hand, I don't think that we should go off the deep end in the sense of that there is no such thing as a hermaphrodite, as a male, as a female.
No, the question is what attributes do you give to a male and a female? I mean, no one is as far as I know, is going off the deep end and saying there aren't. I mean, it's actually a very radical thing to point out that hermaphrodites are very common in our population. When I pointed out the commonness of them to my undergraduate students in this biology of gender course, they were stunned. I said, think about that. I said, 1 in 100. That means that there are probably several hundred on campus, maybe even in this classroom. I mean, it was a shocking thing because our social construction of gender is that there are only 2. That's not true. There's more than 2, even among humans. There are 2 are the most common. So the minute you get past the production of sperm and the production of egg, which clearly there are among humans some people who can do one and some people who can do the other, and maybe some who can do both, although mostly hermaphrodites can't do either. You get the minute you step beyond that, you step into a realm in which the question of what you mean by male and female is socially constructed.
My concern is only that And I hear it in all, not just in this particular thing, but in terms of, okay, I'm working on fish breeding.
Yeah.
And as soon as you say, I'm working on animal breeding, you mean, oh, you know, gene transfer and all this, and people are almost, I see, going off, like I say, the deep end in the sense of we have to remember that there are things that science can do, and I almost feel like there's a pushing away from it because it is full of the things that you're talking about, and we have to recognize the good points and the bad points and what we need to work on and improve within science.
There are things that science can do. I wouldn't be a scientist if I didn't think that. But I think that you may need to think more radically about science still. It isn't a question that there's some good points and bad points about science. Science is what it is, and it has a particular social function in our culture, and it does certain kinds of things, and it doesn't do other kinds of things. It doesn't, for example, worry about how the whole organism functions. The medical science doesn't worry about things like nutrition when it's treating. It doesn't worry about things like the interaction between stress and the nervous system and disease. These are things that currently science has defined out of its realm. So it can do good science within its narrow definitions, but it behooves us to remember that it's defined its realm narrowly, so that we can, within that realm, then go hunting for particular genes that are involved with the production of muscular dystrophy or something like that, and we're very talented at doing that. It doesn't mean that we, in the end, are actually understanding disease systems. We're not. We're understanding individual genes that are parts of disease systems. So one of the things that in a way, I say scientists know thyself, because if people are going off the deep end and just sort of rejecting gene transfer and all of these sorts of things, it's because there is a profound understanding, I think, although maybe not very articulate, of the ways, of the limits of what scientific investigation as it's currently constructed can tell us about the body and about how it works. I mean, to have a war on cancer that focuses on the genes which cause cancer without talking about cleaning up our polluted air is, to my mind, it's a very partial notion of science. And people who are rejecting that partial notion, even if it seems sort of know-nothing to us, also listen to what they are saying. They actually know something about what science isn't doing. And I think that it behooves us as scientists to develop a more radical self-criticism that enables us to hear what people are saying when they're saying that. Yeah.
Yes, well, I certainly enjoyed your statement right at the beginning. Knowledge comes from somewhere. I really think that's what we're saying. Knowledge does come from somewhere. These are the systems. I was glad to hear you say that, because when we see these slides, when we see these taxonomies, that comes to us with great authority.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you would consider going back past Linnaeus into some of the ways in which the scientific method was brought about to help us provide. For example, your way you describe the metaphors, that stuff was happening, I think, far long before Linnaeus with Bacon use of rate metaphors, use of sexual metaphors to explain nature, and linking nature to the wild chaotic nature that women had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Both Carolyn Merchant and Evelyn Fox Keller have written about Bacon and his use of sexualized metaphors, and I think they're relevant. I had to give a starting point somewhere. And for me, since the starting point in an elementary biology textbook is always Linnaeus, it seemed like a good place to start. But there are other scholars who are certainly moving earlier. It's not. That's why I said in the beginning. I mean, Linnaeus had a history. You're absolutely right. But you have to intervene somewhere. I mean, even though I threw a little something to the Bible in the beginning. basically, I'm not prepared to start with the Bible and move forward. I'm having a hard enough time with the 18th century. But you're absolutely right that there is a history to be told and that people are telling it, and it's quite an interesting one, which certainly then sets the stage for the 18th century and Linnaeus.
Perhaps one last question.
Gentleman way in the back.
I was wondering if you might have a critique of the system of classification based on relatedness of the genetic genome of a species, simply from comparing not inside a species, but if you were to try to talk about the relatedness of two plant forms, in that you were saying that classification generally, there is no basis to it. I mean, it's mostly our associated structure.
No, I'm not saying there is no basis to it. Just the opposite. There's a social basis to it, and it may be a perfectly good basis. It's not. The question is, could I talk really about contemporary systems of classification based on relatedness of DNA? Is that fair enough? I haven't worked it through completely. I mean, I'm just starting to think about it. It's the half of the chapter I haven't written yet, but I intend to write it. But some of the thoughts I have to do with thinking, again, about what has happened to the notion of the organism when you essentially reduce the organism to a linear code of information, which is what you do when you use DNA as the sole measure of relatedness. There's certainly molecular taxonomy is a new and exciting field, and it produces a lot of interesting information. It also produces a lot of conflict and disagreement. There are basically 4 contending systems of classification around today. Molecular taxonomy is one, phonetics is one, cladistics is one, and the sort of more classical Darwinian evolutionary taxonomy is one. And they don't come up with the same answers about how animals and plants are related to one another. What answers they come up with depend on what assumptions they make about what organisms are and where they come from and what their meaning is on Earth. I mean, that's a general answer. But what you do see, except for the Darwinian system, but within cladograms, phonetics, and molecular taxonomy, is a recasting of the organism, not as some intact whole, but rather as a system of information readouts. And that is certainly, it's a very post-World War II construction of what knowledge looks like. It comes straight out of the development of cybernetics in the war industry in World War II, and so it carries with it its own social baggage. It doesn't mean to say it's a terrible method of classification. That's why I'll repeat what I said in the end. I am not saying that all systems of classification are bad. I'm simply saying that they have social origins and that it behooves us to recognize what they are. And they all have limitations. There is no perfect system, and there never will be. Although the history, if one reads conventional histories of classification, what one sees is someone is always searching for something that they call the most natural system. And I'm arguing that there is no such thing as a most natural system, that all systems are constructed and work. Some of them work very well, and that's fine. And I'm happy to use them in the field, and I'm happy to use them in the laboratory. That's not the objection. The point is that they all come from somewhere socially. And the fact that race and gender in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries are among the most powerful organizing systems, social systems, the most powerful systems that are used to organize our social knowledge, it seems improbable to me that they are not implicated in the organization of biological knowledge, just like they are implicated in the organization of all of social knowledge. So what I'm doing in this exploration is essentially painting out where one might look and sketching out what a story that includes race and gender as part of the construction of biological knowledge, what that story would sound like. I guess we're cutting off questions, is that right? Okay, well, thank you all.
my pleasure to be able to thank Dr. Fausto-Sterling. I know science is popularly held to be value-free, but as Dr. Fausto-Sterling's examination this evening has shown us that scientific processes and the history thereof, she has shown this to be false. I know for myself, for one, will be interested to see how she handles the Darwinian times, where we look at the as it were, the struggle between theology and science, who both thought they had a monopoly on the truth in terms of the status quo. It is interesting that she brought out what I would almost call her own social construction of reality with the beginning story in Genesis, because there are two creation stories in the first chapter of Genesis, and most of us only know the one that she cited for us, in which it's the rib, not the one in which male and female, he created them to be equal. And so we have these social constructions that go along. And as she started showing her slides up there, I hope to, that we remember more using sort of a false syllogism that Canadians are not all flat-headed monsters. Thank you.
Before you all leave, I'd like to invite you all on behalf of the Nancy Jackman Chair to a reception in Seaton 405, the Faculty Lounge, and I'm sure that Dr. Fausto-Sterling would entertain any further questions you might have.